QSO Today, episode 326, Bob Weed, W7SCY. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you to check out their new IC705 all-band portable transceiver and their new ID52A dual-band portable. My thanks to ICOM America for their continued support of the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, 4Z1UG, your host. We are now in the process of enrolling exhibitors to the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo coming in March 2021. If you have a business or organization that you'd like to be represented in the largest virtual ham expo convention in history, then please visit our website at qsotodayhamexpo.com exhibitor page. A link to our site is in this week's show notes page. If you live in the Cascade Mountains in Oregon, a mountain range with earthquakes, fires, mudslides, and live volcanoes, then as a ham operator, emergency communications and net operation may be a way of life. Bob Weed, W7SCY, shares his 70-plus years of ham radio operation that includes nets and emergency traffic in this QSO Today. W7SCY, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Bob?
Yes, Eric. 4Z1UG, this is Whiskey 7, Sierra Charlie Yankee, you're 5 and 9.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, it really started when I stumbled across a couple of hams talking on the radio when I was about 13 years old. We had a floor-standing radio in those days, which was common, that had shortwave bands. And I stumbled across a couple of guys talking to each other on the radios. And I thought, this is magic. So I expressed an interest. And I guess my first Elmer was a non-ham. My father, he dug up, apparently went around and talked to some people and found that the local radio repair guy, Kay Cutler, had been a ham. And my dad said, well, my son's interested in radio. Would you mind helping him out? So he introduced us. And Kay Cutler then was the first later ham. He had been licensed before the war and had let his license expire. But he really took me under his guidance. He taught me to solder. He showed me how to build a crystal set, gave me the parts to put it together. I put it together and was able to hear a local radio station through the headphones. And again, that was magic.
So what was the hometown? Where did this take place?
Myrtle Point, Oregon, a town of 3,000 people along the southwestern Oregon coast, a little inland from the ocean. And there were no hams in Myrtle Point. So that made it a little more difficult. My father then bought an instructograph, which was a wind-up paper tape code sender that had punched holes, and we'd build a little code oscillator with the help of Kay Cutler, and we used that to try and learn the code. But at that time, the only ham, the entry-level ham, was general class, and at that age and at that time, and without any other hams around, I wasn't able to hack that. And then when I was 14 years old, 1951, the FCC came out with a new novice class license. And I only had to do 5 words a minute of code. And I think it was a 25-question exam, mostly rules and regulations. And I was able to do that. But we lived 240 miles from Portland, which was the nearest FCC office. And my father did some more research, and he found a ham about 17 miles away in a little burg called Riverton, Oregon. He was a farmer, and he had a cranberry farmer, actually, and he was a ham. And so my dad took me over there, got me introduced, and he actually gave me the test by mail. It took me 3 months to get the license, but in July 1951, which I am told is the first month that the FCC authorized the novice license, my license came, and it was W7SCY. Kay Cutler then helped me build, gave me a diagram and gave me some parts. And I used a breadboard, really, with a sheet metal panel and parts from an old 1920s radio. I still have one dial left from that radio, and built a single tube 6AG7 crystal controlled radio with an antenna connected to a fawn stock clip, a flashlight bulb in series with it, and you tuned the two knobs until the flashlight bulb was brightest and I was on the air.
What was the receiver? Was it the console that you still had in the living room?
No, by that time, somehow my father had acquired a used Helicrafter's S40B, and I used that receiver for years as my only receiver up until the time when we got a transceiver, when they built for a long time, of course, you had to have a separate receiver and transmitter.
Now, it's my understanding from the little bit of research that I did that your father ultimately got his license too, didn't he?
He did. So I guess that I was his first gentleman. I inspired him in a couple of years after I was. And of course, at that time, they were going through the alphabet the first time, starting with W7AA, and they got to W7SCY. My dad came along a couple of years later, and he started as a novice, WN7TLQ, worked up later to W7TLQ, and was active for the rest of his life. And then the two of us inspired my grandfather, and he was in Vernonia, Oregon, a hometown that my great-grandfather had helped to settle. And he got interested in ham radio at the age of 76 and was written up in QST as the oldest novice in the United States at the age of 76, and got on the air and worked his code speed up. Drove to the FCC in Portland for, I think, 5 times before he finally passed the general class test. But he was determined to get it. And he told me to his dying day that he thought that they gave it to him in sympathy. And he was W7ZKJ. So he was right at the end of the alphabet. Then my little brother came along. He's 7 years younger than I am, Roger. He got interested because of all of us, and he got his license when he was 13, and he just missed the W7s. He was K7AEF, right at the beginning of the K calls, and he's still licensed today. He went from there to L7HOT for 16 years in Alaska, and now he lives in Arizona, and his current call is KV4 item, Kilo Victor 4 India.
And so that's a vanity call that he chose because he didn't live in Foreland, right? He lives in Sevenland.
Right. He was from Sevenland, and when he moved to Foreland, his call was KL7. He spent so much time explaining to people why a KL7 was in Florida that he applied for a vanity call and found that he got his extra class license shortly after I did and my wife did. And he got the call KV4 India.
Since we're talking about the entire family here, your wife is also a ham, right?
Yes, she is. When she got interested in me, she found that I was a ham, and she showed some interest in that. And I jokingly say I wouldn't marry her until she got her license. And her first call was KA7IZH. And she later upgraded to general class and became N7CQC, and then she and I and our son, there's more coming, worked together and all upgraded to extra class a few years ago. And her current call is NW7CQ. Great call for her, I think.
Is her favorite operating mode CW?
No, she doesn't like CW. Although, interestingly enough, she took her novice test in a sailboat in Puget Sound with some friends of ours who were sailors. And they gave her the test in the sailboat while we were sailing. She passed that test, and she said she never wanted to go back to it.
Sailing or ham radio?
She still likes to sail. She loves ham radio, but she doesn't like CW.
You've created a whole generation of hams around you, ahead of you and behind you.
Yes, and then her son came along later, and he is now an extra class ham, KF7RB, and his wife got her license last year, and she is KJ7CHG. We're working on the grandson.
So here you are, you're a 14-year-old, 1951 novice class license. How long were you a novice class before you upgraded?
It wasn't very long. I got my license in July, and in December, we went back to W7EUG on a dark and stormy night on the Oregon coast to take the general class test. So that was, 5 or 6 months. And it was a trying time. The power went out about 3 times during the test during a big storm, and they would bring out flashlights and light candles and stuff, and we'd continue, and then the power would come on, we'd blow out the candles, and then the power would go off again. But I passed it, and at that time, it took a very long time to get the license. I took the test in December, and the license came on February 17, 1952. February 17.
Now, you say you went to W7EUG, so you didn't have to go to Portland to take the test. Were you taking the conditional license test or the general then?
It was the conditional. At that time, if you lived more than, I think it was 200 miles from the nearest examiner, somebody who at that time was called Class A, which today is extra class, could give you the test by mail. So that was the beginning of the I guess the volunteer examiner program, although they didn't call it then.
And it was only used in extraordinary conditions, like you're being more than 200 miles away from the FCC office.
Yes, and that was a conditional license, and later on, the conditional license became general class.
So what happened after that? Were you the only ham radio operator in your high school?
Yes, I was the only ham radio operator, and my dad was the only other ham in town. In 1955, I think I actually started a little ham club to get people interested in the high school. And we got a helicopter's receiver, and I installed an antenna on the roof of the school. Then we got a little ham club going, and some more people got interested and got licensed. And then one day, Kay Cutler surprised me and called me as W7DKJ. And I said, do you have a license? And he came back very, very insulted and said, of course I have a license. Do you think I'd be on the air without a license? And he had clandestinely gotten his license to surprise me.
It seems quite amazing that you were such an inspirational little guy in terms of influencing a large number of people to become ham radio operators, changing the whole face of your town.
I was enthusiastic about the hobby and was having a lot of fun with it. 1955 was kind of an interesting year. In 1955, I was home for Christmas from Oregon State College, where I was going to school. And a big storm came, and the Myrtle Point was cut off from the outside world by floods on one side of town and slides on the other side of town. And early in the morning, I had been working at a lumber mill driving a truck in the summers, and my boss, who owned the mill, called me and said that there had been a big landslide out by the mill, and he wasn't able to reach anybody or call out anywhere, except that he was able to reach me. And he said the landslide had buried a house with a family of 7 people, and 5 of them had been killed. And the rest of the other 2 needed to be rescued, teenagers. And so I got on the Oregon Emergency Net then, and I was a member of the Oregon Emergency Net, and still am, as a matter of fact, and made arrangements with a ham in Roseburg, Oregon. His name was Don, and his call was W7SCY, and he mounted a rescue effort with an ambulance and a truck with a bulldozer on it, and took his mobile rig. And we kept in touch as he wended his way through. And every time they came to a slide, they unloaded the bulldozer and got through. And they managed to get there in the middle of the night, and they saved 2 people. So I have a public accommodation award from the Public Service Accommodation Award from the ARRL for that event. And that was written up in the June 1956 QST magazine. So that's my one claim to fame.
Oh, I'm sure you have many claim to fames. Let me ask you, usually I ask at this point, did ham radio inspire you to a career or an education in electronics and radio? How did that go? You said you went to Oregon State College. What did you study there?
Well, I was going to be an electrical engineer, and it became evident that I needed lots of math, which wasn't my strong point. And also, electrical engineering was very theoretical. And I just wanted to build and maintain things for radio stations. So I dropped out after 2 years and went to Grantham School of Electronics in Hollywood, California, and got my first class radio telecommunications license, which qualified me to work on transmitters and transmitting equipment and broadcasting. and went to work at a radio station in Crescent City, California, KCRE, and was the chief engineer and only engineer. That's a station where everybody has to start. You get your first job in radio, and it had a high turnover. And I walked in the day that the chief engineer quit, and I was the new chief engineer. And of course, I had to be a disc jockey. So my first day on the radio was the Sunday, and I was on the radio my very first day, and the FCC inspector walked in and wanted to do a full inspection of the station. And I was the only one there. That was trial by fire.
And how did that work? Did he wait until you were off the air in order to make that inspection, or did he look around while you were broadcasting?
Well, he looked around while I made a panicky call to the general manager, who immediately came in and took over.
And now this message from ICOM America. Ham for the holidays. ICOM's new ID52A and IC705 give hours of fun and enjoyment working your favorite bands this holiday season. ICOM's newest handheld amateur radio is the ID52A. The ID52A is a larger radio with a larger color display and louder audio. This VHF-UHF digital transceiver is much more than a replacement for the ID51A, but it also is a new way of communicating. The color display is 2.3 inches for exceptional viewability, and the audio is 80% louder. This multifunction dual-band D-Star transceiver supports DR mode for easy access to local repeaters based on internal GPS information as well as terminal access point modes. The ID52A has Bluetooth for audio and data control, providing improved mobility and control. And for the first time in amateur radio industry, you can now send photos from a connected Android device. Other features include wideband receiver with guaranteed ranges of 144 to 148 MHz and 440 to 450 MHz. It has a VV, UU, VU, and dual DV mode, integrated GPS receiver, including grid square location, micro SD card slot, micro USB for data transfer, programming, and charging, and it's IPX7 waterproof. The ID52A is the perfect companion to the IC705. Both use compatible batteries and headsets, and you can also use the same Android app for D-Store operation. The IC705 is the perfect sidekick to the ID52A for hams that like to enjoy what both the great indoors and outdoors have to offer. This is the perfect QRP companion, base station features and functionality at the tip of your fingers in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at just over 2 pounds with RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 megahertz. Other features include 4.3-inch touchscreen with live band scope and waterfall, 5 watts out with a BP272 battery pack, and 10 watts with 13.8 volts DC supplied. Single sideband CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functions. Touchscreen display, micro USB connector, Bluetooth and wireless LAN. Integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger. Micro SD card slot. Speaker microphone. The HM243 comes standard. Supports QRP and QRPP operations. The perfect accessory for the IC705 is, of course, the optional backpack, the LC192, with a special compartment for your IC705 and room for accessories for soda activations or a day of social distancing in the park. The IC705 is now shipping. Follow the link in the ICOM banner ad in this week's show notes, or go to www.icomamerica.com/amateur for more information on these fine rigs. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsorship of the QSO Today podcast. And now back to our QSO. Now, Crescent City, as I recall, is almost to the end of Northern California, right? You're almost to Oregon at that point.
Yes, it's right on the Northern California border.
So that's one of those markets that if you want to get into broadcasting, you kind of start in a rural market and then work your way, towards a major city. Did you do that, or did you end up staying in rural radio stations?
Well, I was there for 7 months. I was the third longest all-time employee, 7 months. It was a 250-watt daytime station built in the converted sheep pen on the county fairgrounds. And it was an interesting experience, but it got me in. And after 7 months, I made a little weekend trip to, my wife at the time lived in Sweet Home, Oregon, and we went up there for the weekend. And I stopped by a radio station in Lebanon, Oregon, KGAL, which had been the top station when I was at Oregon State. They're both in the Willamette Valley. Oregon State's in Willamette Valley. Lebanon is only 30 or 40 miles away, maybe less. And I happened to drop in the station the very day that the chief engineer had turned in his resignation, and they hired me on the spot. And I spent 5 of the happiest years of my radio career at KGAL in Lebanon. And they were really, the general manager was a guy by the name of Don Wellman, no other hams, but he gave me my lead, and he said, come up with ideas, and then he'd say, do it. And so we had a lot of fun. We did a lot of remote broadcasts by telephone, and I conceived the idea of taking a Johnson Viking 2 and converting it for a broadcast link. And I got the FCC to license it for a remote broadcast link on, I've forgotten the frequency, but it was just above the 10-meter band. Put it in a van with a big antenna on it. We had radio on the go, and we did live broadcasts direct to the radio station in the days before they had things like that. That was about 1959. And we had a lot of fun at that radio station, and it was a great learning experience.
Now, were you an active ham radio operator at this time?
All the time, yes. I had antennas everywhere I went. In fact, I even took my Gonset Commander to school with me and had it in my room at my fraternity with an antenna out the window to a tree. So, yes, I was on the air all the time. And I had to be a disc jockey in order to be an engineer, but I was the nightman at the radio station so that when we signed off the air at 10 o'clock, I could work on equipment. And we had a lot of fun there and did a lot of interesting things. One of the interesting things was not only the ham transmitter, but the guy who owned the radio station owned 3 radio stations and lived in Salem, Oregon. And a couple of interesting things he did. He had me build a complete, it was before stereo, complete monaural hi-fi system and a cabinet and everything. And I installed it in his home in Salem, which was quite a big mansion built in the 1920s. And I later, just last summer, we discovered that place is now the governor's mansion in Oregon. And they hosted us to tour the mansion and give them some background information about it. So that was sort of fun. And then he sent me to Longview, Washington, one of his radio stations, to build a 5,000-watt Collins transmitter, 3-phase power and all that, and put it on the air. And that came in 20 crates. It was like a giant Heath kit. That was a lot of fun.
So did you stay in broadcast throughout your career?
I stayed in broadcasting for 35 years, but it took a turn that I didn't expect. Don Wellman at KGAL, I was doing some interesting things at night, and so he made me morning man and kept giving me other jobs to do. And by the time I left KGAL, I was in sales and management. So I spent some time in sales and management and came to the attention of the Radio Advertising Bureau in New York City over a couple stations later when I was in Everett, Washington. And they hired me to work for the Radio Advertising Bureau and teach other people how to do marketing of advertising. So I ended up doing seminars and ended up later, after 22 years, as senior vice president of the Radio Advertising Bureau in New York City. So it went a different direction, but all the time I kept the radio. And when we were in Nora, of course, my wife was a ham then, and we spent 10 years in Georgia, Peachtree City, Georgia, and that was the height of our ham radio career, I guess. We had a 50-foot tower and a TH6DXX beam, an FT101E Yaesu transceiver, and a Clipperton amplifier. And at that time, in the 1980s, and in that location, we could work the world, sometimes either direction, on the other side, off the front or off the back. It was a great ham radio.
You say you spent some time in New York City working as an advertising vice president. How was that for an Oregon guy moving to New York City? a rural Oregon guy moving to New York City?
Well, I have two feelings about that. Number one, it was magical. I never lost the thrill of, we lived in Connecticut and I took the train to work every day. And getting off the train and walking down Park Avenue to my office and thinking, geez, and walking in the building and seeing my name on the reader board in the lobby, I thought, boy, I never had any reason to believe I'd ever see New York City when I was growing up in Myrtle Point, much less be working there. So I loved that. The work was grueling. Things just pour in on you in New York City faster than you can deal with. It was a grueling time. So I was there for a couple of years, and then I ended my career in radio there. By the way, I guess I have to also mention that the one thing that was good about that job is that I was doing seminars around the country. And I did a seminar in San Bernardino, California, and a lady named Nora, who was sales manager of KC in San Bernardino, liked what I had to say during the morning session, and she clandestinely went into the lunchroom and switched the name tags so she could sit next to me at lunch. And last weekend, we celebrated our 39th wedding. So that worked out nicely. So ham radio led me to broadcasting, which led me to Nora.
And you led her to ham radio.
Yes, and she is a volunteer examiner. She's a member of ARIES and the St. Charles Hospital radio system. So she's active in radio too, although she's not as passionate as I am.
What's your favorite operating mode?
I do a little bit of everything. Single sideband primarily on HF. I also am active with the High Desert Amateur Radio Group and was in net control for 3 years with their Tuesday night net on a 2-meter repeater system. There are 7 linked repeaters here. So I do that. I do a little bit of CW. I found an interesting thing about CW. I used a bug years ago when I was early licensed. And as the Vibraplex bug has automatic dots, but the dashes are as long as you hold the key. And when I converted to the paddle, I found that I hold my dashes too long. And so I'm getting 2 dashes every time I only want 1. So I've had to work on that a little bit. I'm still working on it.
So the Vibraplex bug, actually, when you push the dot side or the dit side, had a little mechanical thing that kind of wobbled back and forth and made the dits, right? So are you saying that you actually connected the bug to a keyer as well so that it would actually make its own dashes?
No, that was before the keyer. You plugged it right in just like CW. You just plugged it in instead of a key. And the only difference was it had contacts on both sides. And when you push the button, push the side toward the dots, it had a spring tension. And when you pushed it over that way, it would, depending on where the counterweight was on the lever, would announce the number of times that the spring would and how fast the spring would hit and then bounce back, and that would make the dots. And then if you pushed it the other way, it was just like a solid connection, like a regular hand key.
If you went right, it went dit, 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 and when you went left, it just went da. So you actually had to make the DAWs by going the other direction from the dits, right?
Yes, the DAWs were as long as you wanted to make them. and as I say, I found when I use a keyer, the keyer, of course, is electronic, and it determines how long your DAWs are going to be. If you hold it down too long, you get an extra DAW.
How important is a computer to you in your ham shack?
It's important in some ways. It's really important today in logging. If you're contesting and so on, logging is a lot better. It's worked. I use WinLink in my ARIES work. WinLink, of course, is sort of like an email on ham radio, and that's good to have. I've used a little bit for FT8 digital. I'm not a big user of FT8. I like to have a little longer conversation than 30 seconds or whatever it is.
Let me take a quick break to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, and that's the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Jeremy, KF7IJZ, and it now includes Michael Walker, VA3MW, where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. The group documents their projects and makes circuit boards available to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Jeremy may complain about the overall length of the podcast, but friends, let me tell you that I could listen to it all day, and that's good. Even if you are a seasoned ham radio builder or just getting started, be sure to join George, Jeremy, and Mike now for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast on every podcast player. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. And now back to our QSO Today. So you like to engage the other side rather than, maybe that's something the younger hams do now, is right? They multitask using the digital modes while they're doing something else, perhaps watching a movie or doing a YouTube or something.
Yes. I check into a lot of nets. My primary focus these days is emergency communications. I'm still a member of the Oregon Emergency Net. Actually, I'm net member number 35, going back to the beginning, and they're up around 1,500 members now. So I'm semi-famous as the oldest member of the Oregon Emergency Net. I also check in the Alaska Pacific Net. I started that when my brother was in Alaska, and he and I both still check into it. And occasionally they have emergencies up there. And I also check into the Oregon now has established a hospital net, a hospital and healthcare net around Oregon through a system of repeaters. And I'm active on that one also.
What is the attraction to you to attend so many nets? What do they do? I'm not a big net person, so maybe I'm missing something, but what about nets attract you to them?
Well, a net is really an emergency preparedness system. In fact, the Alaska Net is called the Alaska Pacific Emergency Preparedness Net. It's good to know that in case of emergency, and by the way, we live in an area where there is a possible subduction earthquake. The west part of the Oregon may fall into the ocean someday. And in that case, this part of the country would be on the east side of the Cascades would become increasingly important to the Oregon government and everything else. And that's what we practice a lot with the ARES too, is knowing who we can reach, when we can reach them, and where we can find them. So that's the advantage of a net. The net lets you know, and by checking in, you find out who checks in, where they are, and you know when to reach them. That was the advantage during the West Coast floods when the slide happened, that I knew that there were hams in Roseburg, and I knew that they'd be there at 6 p.m. And that's how I was able to contact them. So that's the major advantage. Some people don't really get the effect of that. When I check in, I either stay there through the entire roll call in case somebody wants me or needs me or wants bend. And some people just check in and then they leave immediately. And I don't see the value in that. I think the whole point is the ability to know when and where you can find hams in certain places.
After almost 50 years of being a ham, the light just went on. Okay, so I get it. So that means that if there was a real emergency, that net is scheduled to go regardless of what's happening else in the world. So it's like this reliable touchstone of being able to reach somebody, because you know at a certain time when that net is supposed to go, that somebody will be there, that you can actually reach someone.
That's correct. And then you also have a protocol. So in case there is an emergency and there are messages to be handled, there's a protocol to follow, and it's important to know what the protocol is. In ARES, for example, they have the incident command system, and it's a quasi-military or government kind of operation, and you really have to follow that protocol if you're going to handle messages or Now we have, our ARES group has a trailer, and we're under the direction of Sergeant Nathan Garibay, who we also just recently got licensed, so he's a fellow ham with the Deschutes County Sheriff's Department. And we have a sheriff's trailer and a truck to pull it, and I'm vetted to pull the trailer and deliver it anywhere, as well as run the radio systems. We have HF radios with antennas and a power system. And we also have VHF and UHF, 2 dual band radios, and a computer and a complete setup that we can take the trailer any place and set it up and be on the air in a short time. And in fact, we do several events as public service events and are available to be deployed. So it's important that we know how everything works and know how to use the systems and be able to communicate in case of an emergency.
There's a lot of people that probably live in or work in the public safety arena who have gotten ham radio licenses, and it seems to me that while there's almost 800,000 licensees in North America, the majority of them are not active. And many of those licensees have come in through weekend licensing programs because they wanted to be part of a public safety group like ARES. So I get that, and that seems really interesting. However, from what you're suggesting, it seems to me that at least belonging to the ARES in your area, that the hams who join it become very active and they learn how to be able to operate all of the equipment that may be, for example, in this equipment trailer. I'm assuming, right, they learn how to put together HF antennas, things like this. Is this how this goes? Is it an opportunity for teaching and educating?
Yes, it is. And when we do our events, we have the net control in the trailer, and I operate most often, and Nora operates, she's in Aries also. We both operate as net controls, but I'm most often net controls when we operate for different events. We have a big motorcycle, dirt bike race out in the mountains where there's no cell phone coverage. And then we have people deployed at strategic places with mobile rigs, and we operate a net for that kind of for health and safety and welfare. And everybody learns something. People who work in the trailer learn how to run all the radios in the trailer, and the people out in the field learn how to operate in the field as an operator in a net control situation. So it's a good learning experience.
What's the age distribution of the members of your ARES group? Do you have young and old? Is it like the whole spectrum?
We do, but it's mostly older. We're starting to get some of the newer people. We work in conjunction. I say we, the High Desert Amateur Radio Work Club works in conjunction with the Central Oregon Community College and does classes 4 times a year. And Nora and I are volunteer examiners, and we work as examiners on those classes. And once we get people licensed, we encourage them to get involved in these kind of activities or learning. And we're finding a lot of younger people are starting to come. And by younger, I don't mean really young. I find people some in their late 20s and the 30s and 40s. So we're beginning to see some of these people who are particularly in this area where there may be a major subduction, earthquake, volcano eruption, the sort of things that happen in the Cascade Mountains or might happen, that they're getting more and more interested in emergency communications. So we have the hardcore of people who've been around for a long time, and we have the new people coming in. And we work not only as a volunteer examiner, but we also have in HIDARG, that's the High Desert Amateur Radio Group, we have an Elmer session where new hams can come in, and we give them a little background and get them started, and we have them check into a net with a 2-meter handheld radio and get them interested and involved in it. We found you really have to get them involved, and I'd say for new hams, the best advice I can give any new ham is join a ham club, get on the air, and ask somebody for help. And we're available as Elmers for anybody that needs help, and have helped different people in various ways.
Now, you mentioned about the West Coast floods in 1955 and how amateur radio was key to communications to save the people that could have perished in the landslides. But recently, Oregon suffered severe fires that burned over 1 million acres, and 11 people died in those fires. What role did amateur radio play this year, as recently as last month?
We haven't been personally involved in that. We were fortunate enough to be in an area that hasn't been affected, other than some days the smoke was pretty bad. But I haven't, there have been some work on the nets, health and welfare, message traffic, when somebody's home has been burned, particularly in the southern valley area on the west side of the Cascades, Medford, Oregon, that area. And sometimes people are difficult to find, and the hams have gotten involved in being able to go to shelters and areas and put people in touch with the rest of their families, because a lot of those people have lost everything.
What do you think that the amateur radio community in Oregon needs the most right now?
I think they need the same thing we all need. There needs to be the biggest challenge is antenna restrictions. It's difficult with all the new homes that are being built, not only in Oregon, but in the entire United States, with HOAs having antenna restriction. And it makes it really difficult for somebody who really wants to participate to be able to get on the air. And I actually did a program for the High Desert Amateur Radio Group on stealth antennas, ways that you can get on the air. I actually have 5 stealth antennas, and I'm in a restricted neighborhood. It's not optimal. It's not like my 50-foot tower and a TH6 beam, but at least we're on the air and we can communicate.
So what you're saying is that for a lot of people, maybe for most people now, being able to choose a property that doesn't have antenna restrictions or HOAs is getting very difficult. If you want to be near a city or you want to be in an area that has services, then you might find yourself in an HOA. They may be your only choice, right?
It's very likely. All the new housing developments have HOAs, and they all have automatic. Once somebody started that, everybody else just copied it, and they all have no antennas.
Is there something that the amateur radio community is not doing in terms of being able to promote itself and somehow make a case for amateur radio antennas in HOA communities?
Well, I think the biggest thing, the most logical thing that could happen on the local level is an appeal to an HOA. And if you can point out the value of the amateur radio community and the fact that you need to be able to communicate and that it may be helpful. And there are samples or examples of people who've saved lives by being able to communicate when nobody else could. You can appeal to an HOA, and some people here have done that and they have succeeded in getting up modest antennas. But nobody is successful in putting up a tower and a beam and so on. People just don't want that in their neighborhood.
Do you think that they're afraid of radiation?
I think it's mostly sight pollution. They don't want an ugly tower. A tower is not ugly to me, but it's ugly to people who are not ham radio operators. They want a nice, neat, tidy suburban home with nothing obstruction. In fact, a lot of people have even eliminated television antennas. I haven't seen a television antenna anywhere around our home since we've been here.
You're talking about the VHF, UHF antenna that used to grace every home in America 50 years ago.
Right.
How about satellite dishes?
Everybody now is, even satellite dishes. Most of the people now are using broadband for their television.
I'm curious, what's the current rig, and then what is that rig feeding?
Well, my current radio in the house is an ICOM 746 Pro, barefoot. And I have 2 antenna tuners. I have one antenna tuner in the house on the radio, and one of my stealth antennas is a 42-foot wire antenna, insulated wire, brown insulated wire, up a tree, which is actually outside my yard. And I've got the antenna, the lead-in buried along with some radials buried. And I've got a remote tuner at the base of the tree under a fake rock. So that's one of my stealth antennas. Another one is a G5RV. A lot of people don't care for that, but it serves a purpose, and it can work on numerous bands. And I made the G5RV with insulation, the color of the roof, and it's laying directly on the roof diagonally across the house from one corner to the other. And the center twin lead is brown. And it comes down on the side of the house that's not accessible from the street. And that goes to a tuner in the house. And that works pretty good. I have a 20-meter dipole in the attic. We have a fairly high attic. It's about 17 feet above ground, not optimum. But it runs in the attic from one end of the house to the other. That's, what is that, 3? I have a High Sierra motorized antenna, which I used to have in my fifth wheel. When we were snowbirds, we had a fifth wheel. We had the radio ham shack in there. And I have that ground mounted in a little alcove where it's not noticeable from the street, with radios on the ground in some gravel in an area of the house that nobody uses outside. And that's an all-band antenna from 10 to 80 meters. And then the last one is a 2-meter whip, a 5/8 wave whip mounted vertically on a vent pipe, and it's hardly noticeable. So far I've been getting away with it.
So you haven't had anybody come and mention it or see it or anything like that?
I've had a couple neighbors noticed it. Especially the High Sierra was a white antenna, and we happened to have a trail behind our house, a very popular trail, and a couple people noticed the antenna and mentioned it to me just as a matter of curiosity. Nobody has expressed any reason to dislike it. I finally painted the white High Sierra antenna brown, the same shade as the house, and it's not as noticeable now. Nobody's noticed it since then.
Well, it seems to me you could say in Oregon that this is a volcanic activity detection system or something like that, right?
Yeah, something like that.
Are you close to Mount St. Helens? You're in the Cascade Range, which has some active volcanoes.
We're at 3,500 feet on the east slope of the Cascade Mountains. Mount Hood is a little bit north of us. The Three Sister Mountains are here, very nearby. Mount St. Helens is in Washington, on the southern Washington, and I happened to be nearby when Mount St. Helens blew up in 1980. That was an exciting time, too.
You had a whole village disappear, right?
Well, it wasn't a village. It was there was mostly campers, and there was a resort area and a lake, and the lake was buried by the volcano, and several campers. I think there were 70-some people killed in the eruption. They thought that it was going to be like the volcano eruptions, or volcanoes in Hawaii, where the lava just flowed down the side of the mountains. And what they did not expect was the explosive eruption.
That kind of blew the top off the mountain.
Yeah, it blew most of the top off the mountain. The mountain used to be one of the highest mountains in the Cascades in Washington, and now it's just a stubble, really. I've been up there just for the fun of it. We went up and you can walk up. There's a volcano area, a national park area, and you can actually go up and visit there. We did that a few years ago.
Do you contest or work DX? I mean, you've got a lot of antennas, it seems to me.
I do the best I can. We have I'm a member of the Central Oregon DX Club, and they're largely into HF radio, which is something I'm very interested in. And I participate in events with them, Field Day and things like that. We also have a QSO party called 7QP, 7QSO party for the 7th call district. And I take my mobile rig out and try to find a place where people are trying to work all the counties in the 7th call district. And I go up on the hill, the Cascade Mountains, and find a place where two counties meet and operate so they can give them 2 counties from one station. So I do a certain amount of that. I do a certain amount of DXing Field Day, usually working with one or both of the clubs that I'm in, which is the DX Club and the High Dark group. And during Field Day, I have fun talking to people as much as I can. But I'm not hardcore DXer. I don't know if I ever had 100 countries or not. It's hard to get now, especially. But I have a secondary interest. To me, it's just fun to be able to communicate with people in far and distant places. I just wanted to go back. One thing I didn't cover, but some of the radios that I had, I started with my 6AG7 single tube radio. And then next thing I got, Leander, my guy who gave me the test, was 1951 was shortly after World War II, and there was a lot of radios, and he had an ART-13 that ran about 300 watts. I thought it was great. And he said, well, get an ARC-5. They're only $5. So I got an ARC-5 out of a B-17 that worked the 75-meter band, and I converted that to CW so I could work CW. And then I got, I think it was an iMac modulator kit, and I added a modulator to it. And that was, so my first commercial radio was an ARC-5. And then after that, we went to an LMAC A54. I don't know if you've ever heard of any of these. And I went from that to a Gonset Commander, and that was neat. I put that in my car. It was a little radio. And then I wanted a VFO. They didn't make them anymore, but when I was going to Grantham School of Electronics in LA, they were headquartered there. And they said, "Oh, we're not making those anymore, but we got one partially completed. If you want to come in, we'll give it to you with all the parts to finish it." So I did that, and it was an outboard mounted on the steering column with the radio down below, and you just plug it into the crystal socket. And I thought, boy, this is amazing. It's just a tuned circuit that takes the place of a crystal. So I don't even know how they did that because they were a lot more. Then I went to a Heathkit. I built a lot of Heathkit stuff. My first Heathkit was an HT1 handy tester, one of the first things they built. And I burned out a resistor one time, and it was irreplaceable. All the resistors and capacitors in the handy tester were war surplus. They were government olive drab color and so forth. I think that's how Heathkit got started, was that they bought all the surplus parts after the war and got into business inventing things that they could make with them. And then I had the best AM radio I ever had before single sideband came out, was a Heathkit Apache. And that was a wonderful radio. I built that. I still think that was a great radio. And then I acquired the SB10 sideband adapter. And so then it was on sideband. But then I ran across a guy who had a sideband engineer, SBE34. And that was, to me, that was a marvel. It was just, a little radio, worked 20, 40, and 80 meters, and had a transistorized receiver and a one-tube amplifier. It ran about 35 watts. It had built-in AC and DC power supply. And I just set it in the seat of my car, put a bumper mount antenna on the back of the car, and plugged it in the cigarette lighter, and I was on the air. And I used that in travel trailers, too, for a while. But it's just amazing to see the things that people have come up with and the progression that we've had in the industry. So anyway, it's fun. So what kind of equipment are you using now on the air?
Well, you have almost, it seems to me, 70 years in this next year, actually, right? So you'll have 70 years into the ham radio hobby. What do you think is the greatest challenge facing amateur radio now, besides HOAs?
Oh, I think the HOA is the biggest challenge. I think they've made it easier to get a license now. They have the ham cram classes where you can get a license in one day, and it's easier to get a license than it ever has been. But I just see the antenna problem is a big problem for people. And probably we need to do a little more. Some of the exciting things that are coming up, they're getting kids interested by letting them talk to the space station, for example. And by the way, when I was in Georgia in the 1980s, I actually talked to Owen Gary at W5LFL on a space shuttle. And that was an exciting time. I think it's fun for kids to think that they can carry space communications. And the changing technologies, digital communications, I think are going to be interesting for younger people.
What excites you the most about amateur radio now?
Probably just the emerging new systems. I have a handheld satellite antenna, and I haven't yet communicated with the satellite, but I think it'd be fun to try that out. That's an exciting thing to do. And it would be fun to talk to the space stations. There are times that the space station actually is available to talk to hams on, but you just have to be listening in the right place at the right time. I haven't been that lucky yet. That would be pretty exciting, I think.
Do you have advice that you'd give to newer returning hams to the hobby?
Yes. My advice to them is join a ham club, get on the air, and ask for help. There are people willing to help, and you just have to ask for them. Don't just stand back and get the license and wonder what to do.
Why do you think people don't ask for help?
I think it's just difficult for a lot of people to ask for help, particularly adults. We tend to think that we should know everything, and it's hard to say to somebody, how do you do this? I'm not shy. I ask for help.
Well, Bob, you've been a great guest of the QSO Today podcast, and I really appreciate it that you've agreed to come on. With that, I want to thank you so much and wish you
73, Eric. It's been a real pleasure, and thank you for inviting me.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Bob. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in W7SCY in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to ICOM America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of ICOM America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart, Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.